I'm going to start this presentation with an apology. And the reason why I'm going to apologize is you see a list of 4 or 5 PIs there, and associated with those PIs are probably 24 students, HQPs, and so on and so forth. And summarizing the outputs, tremendous amounts of output from all of these people over the period of TriaNet is virtually impossible without making some sort of omission or mistake. And so I'm going to apologize in advance. And if indeed there are some omissions or mistakes, I will direct you to the various people that perhaps can correct me. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do is start you off with a bit of an introduction about what we expect mountain pine beetle to do in its native range by way of its dynamics. And then what I want to do is discuss what we've been looking at by way of novel interactions or novel dynamics in novel habitats. And I've decided to sort of rearrange the various approaches that were originally postulated in the proposal to what I think is, now that we know more, a more logical approach. So we'll look at beetle, fungus, tree interactions, productivity and spread in novel habitats, the possibility of modeling stand risk in these novel habitats, looking at landscapes from the point of view of risk and spread, the potential for persistence in the endemic phase. And that's what I'm going to show as last, simply because here we are talking about, as Stan so aptly pointed out, we're talking about the issue of the persistence of populations after they've finished with the epidemic state over most of the newly invaded areas. And then I put this note here because I'm going to be, as Dave just mentioned, giving you a little skim across the top, trying to pull off the tasty tidbits from the entire theme. And in doing so, I'm going to highlight as much as possible the student contributions, the HQP contributions. And here's what I'm hoping to do is that as I bring up each point and mention each student by name, if you're in the room, please put up your hand. And the reason why I want to do that is twofold. First of all, I want to make sure that you guys get the credit where the credit is due. And secondly, I want to deflect any criticisms that might be coming my way to you. And then, of course, I'm going to wrap things up. So let's talk about mountain pine beetle dynamics in its native range. It's characterized by 2 distinct population phases, as we know so well, and Stan actually did a great job of explaining it. We have the sub-outbreak state, or the endemic state, where negative feedbacks predominate. In other words, as populations grow, they begin to run out of resources, and populations will shrink as a consequence of those negative feedbacks. The second state is that of the epidemic state, or the epidemic condition. And here we have a really unique situation whereby, at least initially, we have the capacity for positive feedbacks to influence population increases. In other words, the more beetles there are, the more potential beetles there will be, because the beetles are actually cooperating to overwhelm tree defenses and then moving on to attack additional trees. And so this is a kind of an interesting situation. And what I want to do is indicate it to you graphically, and I apologize in advance if you find this a bit nauseating, but I'll do it anyways. So essentially what we're looking at here is this as the endemic situation. So effectively, where you've got this 0 line, this indicates where above that you have the possibility of positive population growth. And below the line, this straight line here, you have the negative population growth. So in other words, in this case, this is a clear evidence of negative feedbacks. The endemic populations here can grow only so big before, of course, they're forced back as a consequence of negative density-dependent effects. Now, by contrast, that's the way the epidemic scenario looks. And just as I mentioned before, what we've got is the potential for populations, at least in this part of the curve, to increase rapidly at an increasing rate as a consequence of positive feedbacks. So the minute the beetles are capable of mass attacking successfully a large diameter tree, they will produce a lot of offspring, which in turn can mass attack more large diameter trees, and hence the case of positive feedback. And that persists, of course, until they begin running out of food themselves and negative feedbacks then reassert themselves. So essentially, the question is, how do we get from an endemic population to an epidemic population? And that can only happen when those 2 curves intersect above the 0 line here. That happens typically as a consequence of some sort of perturbation. We call it a density-independent perturbation. So in other words, something like drought, something that happens to influence the amount of available host material and influence the capacity for populations to grow. And so if we wind up with some sort of perturbation that ultimately leads to a shift in these curves upwards like that, then suddenly we have this point here. where endemic beetles are suddenly growing, but they actually reach a point where they don't dip below the zero line, and they're able to escape into the epidemic phase. And interestingly enough, from some of the earlier work I did with populations in BC, we know this to be roughly 300 to 600 female mountain pine beetle per hectare. That's usually about the point at which we get some sort of shift. So that's how population dynamics typically works in the native range. The question is, will that work in the novel range? And we're going to look at this by examining each of these individual aspects in turn that we've been examining here in novel habitats. All right. So let's look at first at beetle fungus tree interactions in novel habitats. All right, and this is primarily the work of Nadir Erbilgan's lab with Altaf and Sydney. Are they in the room? I want hands raised. There we go, right back there. So if I make mistakes, it's their fault. Effectively, we've been looking here, these guys have been looking here, at whether or not jack pine's defensive capacity is going to vary with growing condition, whether or not resource availability will affect mountain pine beetles' reproduction in jack pine, and whether or not the production of nutrients by fungal associates varies with the jack pine. And typically, what they've found is, indeed, there are interesting results, and most of this is relevant to the issues of enhanced spread risk assessments. So jack pine susceptibility increases under drought stress conditions. The beetles prefer jack pine that are rich in phloem resources, and their productivity may be higher when associated with Ophiostoma montium in jack pine. So clearly these are important issues to consider if and when mountain pine beetle populations move into jack pine and start causing some significant impacts. Now if we turn to productivity and spread, change the channel slightly, and begin asking questions about what we know about productivity and spread in novel habitats. Here we're looking at largely the work from Maya Evanden's lab, and we've got Asha and Caroline and Victor and Kelsey. Who's in the room? Victor is, at least, yeah. Okay, yeah. Kelsey's hiding? Okay, good, great. Keep an eye on her there, because I might actually make a mistake on purpose now. So the questions addressed by this group deal primarily with things like, does mountain pine beetle body condition affect dispersal capacity? Are there trade-offs between dispersal and reproductive output? And how is dispersal itself affected by flight, or by environmental conditions, pardon me. So here we have another series of very interesting results, all of which are relevant from the point of view of management in terms of spread risk assessments. Insofar as things like bigger beetles tend to fly farther, but they also are more prone to fly and fly for longer distances and duration. There's also, interestingly enough, a real significant trade-off between flight and reproduction. We find that beetles that do fly tend to actually ultimately produce fewer offspring. And finally, beetles are picky about what they're doing in terms of dispersal. They fly at optimal conditions, around 20 degrees, and they'll fly longer under conditions of longer day length. So once again, this can inform our assessments of spread risk towards and through the boreal. If we turn our attention now to modeling stand risk, and here I have to take full credit for any mistakes that I'm probably going to make. This is some work done in my lab, and we were asking the question whether or not we can use stand conditions together with topographical and climatic information to predict mountain pine beetle productivity in novel habitats. And this is an interesting effort, because what we did is we actually began by taking all of the R-value survey data collected by Alberta Ag and Forestry and began to ask whether or not there are patterns in those data that will allow us to construct a model that can predict the productivity of mountain pine beetle in each stand type. And in fact, we were very successful, thankfully enough, and we found that R values can be reliably predicted using variables that are readily derived from forest inventory, topographical, and meteorological data sets. And these types of relationships have turned out to be very useful for spread risk assessment, control prioritization, and impact prediction. And indeed, this particular model, which I think has been called PRED-R now, is actually being widely used by Alberta Ag and Forestry and licensees as well. So this is very gratifying. If we scale up and begin asking questions about risk across landscapes, this is primarily the work coming out of Mark Lewis's lab. And so what I'm going to do is present a little bit of a presentation for each student. Dean is in the room somewhere. I saw him. There's Dean. Okay. So according to Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, Dean has been looking at dynamic systems modeling as well as machine learning from the point of view of decision trees and Gaussian processes. And what he's found is that at least through dynamic systems modeling, we can actually have stand-level classification systems for mapping risks based upon host density and proximity to previous year's red attack, which of course is giving us a solid outbreak risk index. And then in terms of the machine learning aspects, decision trees and Gaussian processes, we've got now improved ability for prediction of green attacks that can guide surveys around target and control efforts. Did I get that right, Dean?
Perfect.
All right. All right. Well, let's talk about Melody. I saw her in the room. There she is right there. Okay. So Melody has been looking at a variety of things, mostly focused on the Cypress Hills as a nice self-contained area in which to begin asking some questions about outbreak risk. She's compared statistical and maximum likelihood estimates for outbreak risk. Machine learning, sorry, thank you. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Management functional responses and management strategies. And indeed, what she's found is that both model types do well when predicting outbreak risk, but machine learning is a bit better. She's found that what's interestingly here is that we can actually use almost a predator-prey interaction approach to understanding how management can be used to control mountain pine beetle populations. And further to that, she's incorporated management costs that allow us to determine whether it's possible to improve strategies. So these are all important things in terms of how we expect to deal with the spread of mountain pine beetle into the boreal forest. Nathan, is he here? No, Nathan? Okay. Well, Nathan has been turning his attention more to some of the genetic aspects, considering neutral genetic diversity of invaders as well as genetic diversity under climate change. And the results of his work have shown us a number of interesting things, such as an alley effect in the form found in mountain pine beetle strongly promotes increased genetic diversity as the population spreads into these new environments. And further to that, that higher diversity can be linked to slower climate change and smaller habitat sizes. And so effectively we're looking here both again at models that can actually be used to understand the spread of mountain pine beetle as well as ultimately their impacts. And finally, I know Devin's not here, but we can't talk about any of this without mentioning some of Devin's great work. Devin is now a postdoc in the States. Devin has examined minimum founding populations for mountain pine beetle. He's examined the aggregations and alley effects associated with outbreaks, as well as some of the mechanisms behind these booms and busts in populations. And he's found that that we can define minimum founding populations based upon various approaches that are defined by the alley threshold and dispersal rates. He's got good agreement with observations and connected outbreak dynamics to measure parameters such as R values. And he's determined the population growth mechanisms underlying the boom and bust dynamics. So once again, we've really gone a long way to interpreting risk of outbreak and spread across landscapes. So here I want to turn my attention now to what can and perhaps might happen with regards to mountain pine beetle after the epidemic is over. So as Stan pointed out, and as I tried to explain at the outset there, mountain pine beetle is an insect that exists typically in two population phases, which means that if it's finished as an epidemic beetle, it has to be doing something as an endemic beetle. We know that is a whole distinct suite of behaviors that it employs to be endemic. And so essentially, in my lab, Stan, raise your hand, there we go, and Jordan together have been looking at whether mountain pine beetle populations can persist in novel habitats following epidemic collapse. And effectively, what Stan has found through a lot of his very hard work is that we've got reduced niche availability to endemic beetles in jack pine forests as a consequence of a whole series of trophic interactions. Fewer trees available to colonize, lower diversity but a higher abundance of subcortical competitors, higher frequency of overlap with wood borers and increased interspecific competition for phloem, and a higher probability of interaction and predation by woodpeckers as a consequence of association with wood borers. And the last that I want to mention is Antonia, who's here. Yeah, there she is, working both with Maya and myself. And Antonia has been doing a variety of things, not least of which is asking whether or not mountain pine beetle populations, if they were to collapse to endemic, can then erupt back to epidemic. And her work has shown so far, it's ongoing, but it's shown so far that there are significantly lower attack densities required to successfully colonize and mass attack naive trees. This increased availability of healthy trees may actually offset the reduced niche associated with the endemic phase beetles, and this is something that is going to be ongoing and something we have to assess. So just to wrap this up, hopefully not too late, with a series of conclusions. First of all, from the biological perspective, the TreeNet group, the Theme 3 research, have reduced the uncertainty regarding mountain pine beetle dynamics in newly invaded habitats at the tree stand and landscape scales. We have firmly concluded that novel pine populations and species are viable hosts, perhaps even better than the native range. Endemic populations are likely to persist and spread in the short term. However, in the long term, the post-epidemic or the collapsed populations may not be able to persist as endemic populations. However, that could be offset by the fact that fewer beetles may be required for a population eruption. And just to show you how that actually can manifest, if we do get a change in shape of the epidemic phase curve, you can see that there's the potential, even though that the endemic phase has been compressed, that there's the possibility of intersection above the zero line right here, which means that in this particular instance, if this is indeed true, then there's no need for mountain pine beetles to be endemic at all. They could persist as epidemics by attacking at low densities large diameter trees. And finally, just to roll things up with regards to management, TreeNet Theme 3 deliverables can contribute to management through improved assessment of spread risk at all spatial and temporal scales, enhanced control, prioritization for management agencies, and finally increased efficacy of sampling detection and monitoring programs. And at risk of not offending anyone, there's my acknowledgements. Thanks.